Lately, I have been thinking that I should have finished my playthrough of Before the Shadow, which is the latest expansion for The Lord of the Rings Online. Before the Shadow launched roughly 2 months ago on November 15th, and normally I would easily have played through the new expansion and at least the new questing and story content by now. So why have I barely played through the new leveling experience in Before the Shadow? Is the expansion bad? Does Swanfleet and Carlin just not have good quests? Well, I don't think that the content I have done is necessarily bad or low quality, and in fact, I have actually done so little questing in the expansion that I don't even think I'm qualified to comment on the majority of the expansion's new landscape content. So reviewing what I have actually done since the Before the Shadow launch. First, I played around with the new delving system on my Warden and Runekeeper along with running the new skirmish. I then did make a new leveling dwarf Runekeeper and did the new intro experience with the expansion. I then, after that, did more delvings, further experimenting with duoing them and running lower tiers than the highest difficulty, which is what I started with. Now, some of the continued running of delvings at this point was further motivated by the Virtue XP boost weekend, where I had a significant boost to my Warden stats, so I of course wanted to test that out a bit. I then briefly leveled my Dwarf Runekeeper again while spending about half of my play session perfecting my cosmetics rather than questing. Following that, I completely switched gears and actually randomly leveled my Guardian and Beorning, except it wasn't random because it was partially motivated by a double XP weekend and the class trait point changes that did come in the expansion's update that patch. And then right after that, the new instance for the expansion launched, so I spent a play session running that on my Warden and Runekeeper again. Also, around that time, I did get a little bit sidetracked with the Dragonflight expansion in World of Warcraft, which took up a lot of my gaming time at that point. But back to LOTRO before my winter break even a month or two ago, I did have 2 more LOTRO play sessions, one intended to be largely on leveling, but that actually ended up being more focused on in-game content in the new skirmish again. I even got myself distracted during this time with LOTRO's key map file. So then in my last play session before writing this video, I once again chose various end-game content over leveling my Runekeeper. Another thing that was more behind the scenes at this point was that I chose to record new videos versus stream LOTRO and play the new content. Usually early in an expansion, I would go for the opposite and I would actually stream and play through the new content rather than do more regular or downtime type videos. So in this reflection, something you all might be able to tell is that I was ultimately searching for things to distract me from leveling and questing in Before the Shadow. I ended up prioritizing my time or focusing on other parts of the update and expansion, such as the delving system, the new skirmish, eventually the new 6-man instance, and even some of the changes that were just in the patch, such as the clash trait point change. For whatever reason, it is clear that I have not been having quite as much fun with Before the Shadow leveling content than other content in LOTRO or even other games. So while I can make excuses that there were just other exciting things going on, ultimately this is all a long-winded way to say that I have found the quests that I have done to actually be relatively boring, and besides the story and overall experience, I haven't had much motivation to play through it, which might be the bigger part. But first, let's get to that first part, which is why has the questing been boring? And just to be clear, not all of the quests have been bad or boring by any means. In fact, I very much so enjoyed actually the new intro experience in the Before the Shadow tutorial. I actually loved being thrown out into the open world basically right away at level 2. And beyond that, there were a lot of quests that you got early on, which normally I actually like having a ton of quests to do in an area, but a lot of the quests felt like they were kind of all over the place and felt like busy work rather than actual engaging content that flowed well. There wasn't really a great connection between all of these quests. And then on top of that, there was a good bit too much of back and forth and traveling for me, especially at such a low level. So if I'm going to be honest, the questing I have done has been a bit of a letdown, which could partially be because recent LOTRO content has caused me to have higher expectations considering how much I've enjoyed all the questing content for the past couple of years. That said, outside of questing, I have explored a lot of Cardolan and Swanfleet, and looking more towards the future, I will say that Cardolan certainly looks like it can have some fun questing areas, and even Swanfleet definitely has the potential to pick up and become better. It's also exciting to be done with the prologue and finally on the proper Before the Shadow book quest. Now, setting that aside, to get to the other can of worms, which is my motivation to play through Before the Shadow, besides to purely just experience the content. So I have to ask myself, what do I get out of leveling my 375th character to the low 30s? Honestly, basically nothing, especially considering that all year in 2022 we had major updates with new low level zones. So I had already been doing a lot of low level character leveling, and if I were to level a character to be on 30, it would be my work in progress Naked Dordan. So yeah, I ultimately just have very little motivation to level this character, meaning my drive to play through the Before the Shadow content is based entirely on how much fun I'm actually having in Before the Shadow. So you can see why I'm not playing so much if it has not been the most fun and I've had, say, more fun other options. And with this other options, this brings up another issue with Before the Shadow, which is bad timing. While I don't think all the low-level focus and content we have gotten in 2022 is bad, I think there has been, for me at least, a bit of an oversaturation of new low-level content, where for a player like me who has leveled so many low-level characters and made new ones just for these updates, I feel fatigued with that and really just don't want to do it again right now. Maybe in the future I will feel a little bit less tired of new character leveling and will have more excitement for this Dwarf Runekeeper. But on this point, speaking of Dwarf Runekeeper, perhaps one issue with my experience is actually my class choice. It is no secret that the low-level balance and progression is wonky at best in LOTRO. Some classes both perform and feel better in combat at low levels than others. Tactical classes tend to be significantly weaker than physical classes at these levels, and on my Runekeeper, combat is a bit oddly paced is how I describe it with the few abilities that I have. While I actually really enjoy the Runekeeper class as a whole, typically it's around number 2 or number 3 for me in my ranking, it is possible that this Runekeeper is actually detracted from my leveling experience here. And that is how the Before the Shadow expansion in LOTRO has been for me, but what does this matter to you all besides just sharing my story of the expansion and my experience? Does it mean that I do not recommend people buy this mini expansion to play through the content? Is it overall a bad update? Well, I actually already didn't necessarily recommend the mini expansion for a new player who doesn't want to spend money, or for someone who's like not very interested in the new story or leveling experience. The main reason for a new player I wouldn't recommend buying this is because you have other free options, and I'd more so recommend seeing if you even like the game in the first place before buying a mini expansion that's focused on the low-level starter experience. But either way, maybe the story on why I haven't played this expansion all that much might sway your decision towards purchasing or not purchasing the expansion, but just keep in mind how fun you find the questing experience here can definitely vary from my own. And as told throughout this video, there are a lot of situational factors that have impacted my playtime outside of the content itself. But with all of that, I definitely do not think that this was a bad update for LOTRO. In fact, quite the opposite. Before the Shadow actually added a great new intro experience for the game. It added the new delving system, which is exciting and has potential beyond the missions. It also added the first new skirmish in many years, and I have found the skirmish to be enjoyable and more enjoyable than other ones, especially considering it's a defensive skirmish. It added a new 6-man instance, and that type of content has always been like enjoyable from an in-game perspective. The update itself also brought one of the most important changes to character progression in LOTRO since the introduction of the trait tree system in Helm's Deep, which was many years ago, but it made trait points to be acquired only from leveling. Going forward, there was a lot of good in this update that came with the expansion, even outside of the 2 new zones and questing content. And I think moving forward, I do plan to eventually continue my playthrough of Before the Shadow, but it is entirely possible that I will tend to favor other activities unless the questing experience really picks up and I perhaps pick up some motivation myself. I would love to hear what you all think of Before the Shadow, and if you played through it, what you think of the experience. So please do comment your thoughts below, and if you haven't yet considered liking and subscribing for more videos, I hope you all enjoyed this story in this video, and thanks for watching.